Hi there, loves. I'm Lee Nix, bringing you A Memory of Malice. We're back with part 2 of the Teikoku Bank incident. In part 1, we discussed the mass poisoning of 16 people at the Teikoku Bank in Tokyo, and the arrest and conviction of Hirasawa Sadamichi. In part 2, we're going to cover widely held theories on the case, and the aftermath of Hirasawa's conviction. Just like in part 1, Japanese names will be in the Japanese name order, which is last name first, first name last. This episode deals with war crimes committed by the Japanese, largely against Chinese, Mongolian, Korean, and Soviet captives. I understand that this subject is inherently traumatic to a large number of people. Please give this episode a pass if it's going to be harmful for you. But it's time to begin. I think we need to discuss the US occupation of Japan. I know this is a history lesson that none of you asked for, but it's relevant, I promise. It's not a secret that the US wanted Japan to be a shield in its war against communism. It's barely cynical to say that America's active efforts in restructuring the country had to do with trying to mold it into the shape they found most useful. Occupation was just one method. The occupation's power center was something called Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, or SCAP. It referred both to said commander, who at that time was General Douglas MacArthur, and the headquarters where he worked. It sounds like a damn Marvel villain, and, well, you'll see. SCAP had different branches that dealt with different efforts, but the one we're going to focus on in this episode is the Public Safety Division, also known as PSD. The PSD's whole purpose was the reform of the Metropolitan Police Department. In 1949, they would begin a massive program aimed at retraining the police department from the ground up. The PSD had such a chokehold on the police that they received copies of every single police report filed. This also meant they immediately knew when the police began investigating new suspects. At the end of World War II, Soviet forces swept through a small neighborhood not far from the city of Harbin, Manchuria. There they found the destroyed remains of a Japanese research installation by the name of Unit 731. While the Soviets, Chinese, Koreans, and Mongolians were well aware that the Japanese had been carrying out bioweapon research and attacks, this appears to be the time that the US first believed it. Unfortunately, rather than being disgusted by the revelation, the US government wanted to get its hands on that research. American forces captured former Lieutenant General Ishii Shiro, who was not only the leader of Japan's main bioweapon research unit, Unit 731, but was also the leader of the bioweapon program. By rights, Ishii should have been put on trial for war crimes. Unit 731 used human prisoners as guinea pigs for their research. Most of these captives were Chinese and Mongolian, but there were Koreans as well. Whenever any Soviet or US POWs were caught, they were also sent to the facility. I won't go into extreme detail about the brutality in this episode, because it's extremely graphic, and I know that war crimes can be extremely upsetting for people. I'm working on a Patreon episode on Unit 731 right now, and that will include far more exact information. But it is important to get a general sense of the horror that was committed. To get an idea of the scale of the atrocities committed by this unit, I've been researching them for nearly a month. I had to stop my research so I could write this script, and I'm nowhere near finished. Paraphrase from Flowers of the Bamboo. The unit infected, dissected, bludgeoned, injected, poisoned, vivisected, and dismembered people. Unit 731 routinely gave victims diseases such as plague, cholera, anthrax, glanders, syphilis, and dysentery. In an infuriating decision, the US decided to give Ishii and his subordinates immunity for their war crimes in exchange for working for the American government. For a long time, this was only a rumor, but memos revealed in the Freedom of Information Act were found by John W. Powell, and then found again by William Triplett, author of Flowering of the Bamboo. The relevant portions read, "However, it should be kept in mind that there is a remote possibility that independent investigation conducted by the Soviets in the Mukden area may have disclosed evidence that American prisoners of war were used for experimental purposes of BW nature, and that they lost their lives as a result of these experiments. In addition, there is a strong possibility that the Soviet prosecutors will, in the course of cross-examination of Umezu, introduce evidence of experiments conducted on human beings by the Ishii bioweapon group, which experiments do not differ greatly from those which this government is now prosecuting German scientists and medical doctors at Nuremberg." You gotta love how they only really care about American lives, right? Bastards. You're probably wondering how this all connects to the Teikoku Bank incident and Hirasawa Sadamichi. There's a lot to this theory, so I'll try to get all of it. Sergeant Naruchi Hideo had been a Metropolitan Police officer, and may or may not have been involved in the Hirasawa investigation. When he retired, he wrote an article saying that Hirasawa Sadamichi was innocent. He attested to the fact that he had interviewed around 100 people connected with Unit 731. These people believed the poisoning was a professional job. They told him that there was a doctor in Manchuria with the unit who was working on cyanide for mass assassination purposes. More memos found by Triplett seem to back up Naruchi Hideo's story that someone in the Teikoku investigation was investigating Unit 731. Byron Engel, the occupation's man in charge of the police, wrote the following. On 3 March, Mr. Harry Kobayashi, liaison for the MPB, related a request from Mr. Fujita, chief of detectives of the MPB, that the investigators of the PSD attempt to secure any information available pertaining to a group of former Japanese military personnel that were sent to Korea as poisoners during the war. It is believed that these persons were highly trained in the preparation of various poisons, and that a SCAP section is investigating them for possible war crimes. So, that memo referred to Chief of Detectives Fujita Jiro, asking the Public Safety Division for any information they have about Unit 731, because the police believe they're in the custody of SCAP, which they were. Another memo contained the notes a PSD secretary took during a meeting between Fujita Jiro and Byron Engel. It's quite long and the grammar is atrocious, so I'll just give you the pertinent bits. The police have a new lead they hope will be productive. Checking former personnel who worked in the Japanese Army laboratory in Chiba, experimenting with prussic acid to be used as poison during the war. A corps was sent into Manchuria that used this poison on humans and animals successfully. Requests made this information be kept secret for fear of prosecution by War Crimes Tribunal. Modus operandi of the criminal who murdered the 12 people in the bank by the use of prussic poison was very similar to that, as the training developed from the Arsenal laboratory. As example, he mentions first drug and second drug in English. That leads the police to believe that it is someone trained in the Arsenal laboratory. An interesting tidbit mentioned in the memo. Further evidence that leads the police to believe that the murderer was schooled at this Arsenal laboratory is because of the equipment he had with him that answers descriptions of equipment used at the laboratory. At the close of the war, when the laboratory was closed, most of the employees took equipment home, etc. So we know the police were investigating Unit 731. Procurator Takagi and a reporter both say Naruchi wasn't part of the main investigation. Naruchi Hideo may not have been involved, but then, as Triplett points out, how does he know about the 731 investigation? If the police were seriously investigating this link, one wonders why they suddenly dropped it to focus on Hirasawa. It's widely theorized that SCAP buried the investigation into Unit 731 to protect their interests. It's a fact that SCAP censored Japanese newspapers that tried to mention 731. There's yet another memo about it. Seriously though, I understand in bureaucracy you need to file everything in triplicate, but maybe a successful plot doesn't involve keeping all your incriminating paperwork. Spy movies had me believing they at least burnt that shit. In the memo, someone from SCAP requests the censors cooperate in stopping publication of any article containing any reference to the police investigation of a Japanese army poison school being connected with the Teikoku case. Screen all articles pertaining to the Teikoku case on the basis of whether publication of the article will hinder apprehension of the culprit. Honestly, I'm not a believer in conspiracy theories, but I find this one believable because a lot of the pieces are provable. I don't necessarily believe that SCAP and the PSD targeted Hirasawa, but they likely encouraged the police not to investigate or bring charges against Igi and Unit 731. We know that the poisoner was an expert with poisons. Not only did he use the smallest dose possible on the victims, but the poisoner even took some of the poison himself. The police theorized that the killer was knowledgeable enough to know that the liquid at the top of the poison bottle was precipitate, and if he collected that with the dropper bottle, he wouldn't be poisoned. He even showed the victims the correct method for taking a cyanide solution without throwing it up. Then there's the description of the killer. The victims described a man from 40 to 55 years old, with the majority saying 50. He was 158 to 161 centimeters tall, which is about 5.2 to 5.3 feet. He had a handsome face with pale coloring and a stain or mark on his cheek and a scar on his chin. He had what we would describe as salt and pepper hair and was of medium weight. There's a startling resemblance to the man that Noruchi Hideo's 731 contacts described to him. Their description was 158 to 161 centimeters, 51 years old, black spots on face, pale complexion, gray hair, and a gentlemanly posture and intellectual appearance. In his writings, Morikawa Tetsuro actually referred to a suspect by name. This suspect was Suwa Saburo, a man who died in 1949. Noruchi Hideo had suspected Suwa to be the killer, and Morikawa would use this information to try many appeals, which all failed. The police had access to a photo of 20 members of Unit 731, and it was never shown to any witnesses. Procurator Takagi said there wasn't enough suspicion against 731 to warrant showing it to the witnesses, and they wouldn't have unless they had a specific suspect in the group. But Procurator Takagi has some rather concerning coincidences in his background. During his time serving in the Japanese Imperial Army, he had been stationed in Manchuria. And though Manchuria is a big place, he coincidentally came down with typhus during his time there, which was one of the diseases that 731 was researching. He was actually allowed by SCAP to interview Lieutenant General Ishii Shiro himself. Nothing of value was learned during this interview, but Takagi found Ishii to be a, quote, good, helpful man. So that might tell you something about the procurator's powers of judgment at the very least. Interestingly, in this case, Unit 731 wasn't the only one committing war crimes. When they first discovered Dr. Matsui Shigeru's name card, a letter arrived to the police. More specifically, it arrived to Noruchi Hideo. It told him that during Dr. Matsui's wartime assignment in Java, he had murdered 250 Indonesian civilians, The letter writer was his subordinate and believed him to be responsible for the Teikoku Bank incident. Naruchi went to interview Dr. Matsui, and he cracked like an egg. He admitted that he had killed those innocent Indonesians, but he swore it was an accident. He was trying to administer a typhus vaccine, he swore. He only accidentally injected 250 people with tetanus instead. After that completely believable lie, he told Naruchi that he would help the investigation if they gave him immunity from prosecution for his war crimes. Shockingly, they agreed, and then he gave Naruchi the information about his name cards. That's it. He was traded complete immunity for the murder of 250 innocent people for some information about name cards. That's a shit trade, in my opinion. Matsui's war crimes were confirmed by the same reporter who said Naruchi Hideo wasn't involved in the case. But then I'm left wondering how he knew. And I find Matsui very suspicious in this investigation. A pharmacist at the Tohoku University Hospital was approached by a man trying to buy prussic acid to kill fish in a pond at home. Prussic acid is also known as hydrogen cyanide, and it's considered the most dangerous type of cyanide. This man gave his name as Dr. Matsui Shigeru. The pharmacist just happened to be acquainted with the real Matsui and knew this was an imposter. That's 2 poison-related incidents where someone pretended to be Matsui Shigeru. A highly suspicious coincidence, in my opinion. Whatever this poisoning is about, I believe that Matsui Shigeru was somehow connected to it. No matter who committed the poisoning at the Teikoku Bank, we're left with why. On the surface, it appears that robbery is a motive. A bank and money were the targets. But that falls apart on closer examination. A person desperate or cruel enough to attempt to kill 16 people for money is certainly going to take all the money they can get. Why take only 160,000 yen when they could easily have made off with 460,000? But if the target wasn't the bank, if it wasn't the money at all, but the people, then things make more sense. It is widely believed that the incident was a terror attack by Unit 731 against the U.S. occupation. A show of strength, if you will. Author Matsumoto Seicho, an outspoken critic of the occupation, believes something more sinister. He believes the U.S. was an accomplice in the incident, that they wanted the unit to test their poison as a method of mass murder. Either of these is depressingly likely. The U.S. was interested in Japan's bioweapon research, and they were protecting the unit from prosecution. So it's unlikely we'll ever find the truth. There are clear signs that the investigation in this case was extremely lax. Thousands of people were investigated, yes, but of those, only 3 were ever questioned. And hey, remember Lieutenant Parker? The poisoner said that they'd been sent to the bank by a Lieutenant Parker, both at the Teikoku incident and at an earlier bank. At the time, it was believed that he was never identified. But that's not true. Lieutenant Paul E.J. Parker had worked with the typhus control team in Tokyo, but his information had not been written down in the occupation's medical records. This lead was never investigated. No matter how hard-nosed, no politician wanted to sign Hirasawa's execution order. Instead, he was sent to the Miyagi detention house in 1962, an unheated prison in northern Japan. As one of his supporters said in an article titled "Noose or Pneumonia" at that time, he was moved up there to die, but not by hanging. The government hopes he'll die up there faster of natural causes, because Miyagi is cold and unhealthy. That way they can keep their hands clean officially. The article's title would turn out to be eerily prescient. Hirasawa Sadamichi died in 1987 at the age of 95 from pneumonia. At one time, he had been the longest-serving death row prisoner in the world, but the record now belongs to another Japanese man, Hakamada Iwao. This didn't end the efforts to clear his name. From what I've been able to learn, in Japan, family members of convicts can fight for their exoneration even after their death. Hirasawa Takehiko continued to fight for his adopted father's innocence until his death at 54. Luckily, another family member has taken up the role, but I don't know who that is. I want to talk about Hirasawa's confession. Over the years, people have come up with a lot of reasons as to why he might have falsely confessed, and they usually boil down to his mental health. But you don't need to be mentally ill to confess to something you didn't do. It's a depressingly common occurrence. In a study done in 1987, false confessions were the third leading cause of wrongful conviction in the US, and false confessions appear to happen more often in more serious cases, such as murder. In Japan, nearly 90% of the convictions are obtained using confessions, but opponents say that many of these confessions are coerced. Japan used to have a major documented problem with human rights abuses where the police were concerned. In 1951, a report compiled by Japan's Civil Liberties Bureau compiled almost 800 cases of police violence or intimidation. The problem was so bad that the Public Safety Division wrote a checklist of requirements for police reform, just addressing human rights abuses. When you know this, and you remember that Hirasawa Sadamichi was in police custody for over a month, and that he was questioned 62 times, it's not hard to see the kind of pressure he was under. Hell, coercive interrogations are a continuing worldwide problem even now. When you examine the things he actually confessed to during this time, his confession becomes laughable. Hirasawa gave police an exact route he took from the Ikebukuro station to the Teikoku Bank. Right off the bat, William Triplett points out that it made no sense that he got off the train at Ikebukuro. The bank was around 70 yards from the Shinamachi station. Surely he would have gotten off there, especially since it's about a mile walk from Ikebukuro, and it was raining and busy. When describing the poisoner, Akazawa Yoshiko took special note of his rubber boots. She said they appeared to be clean, which surprised her since it was so muddy out. Another witness says he walked the back path to the bank that day, and the mud came up to his shins. What this tells us is that the killer could only have approached the bank from the paved front road. But in Hirasawa's detailed path, he says he came by the back way. And in case that's not enough, there's more. This one's a bit intricate, so I'll do my best to tell you in a way that makes sense. The killer told the employees that a neighbor's well had been infected with dysentery, and he was correct. The neighbor he had named had an infected well. According to Hirasawa's confession, he had been walking towards the bank and just happened to see an occupation vehicle outside that neighbor's home. He inquired about the situation and was told about the infection. The issue comes from the fact that this neighbor wasn't on Hirasawa's confessed route. He was 2 blocks out of the way of it, in fact. If Hirasawa had taken the route he confessed to taking, he never would have seen this vehicle outside the neighbor's house. Nevertheless, the prosecution posits that Hirasawa arrived at Ikebukuro at 2:50 p.m., walked his route to the bank, including a 2-block detour to see the neighbor's home, and arrived at the Teikoku Bank at 3:15. So it would have taken a man in his 50s 25 minutes to walk an extremely winding route in the pouring rain, burdened by a bag. According to those who have reviewed the confession, Hirasawa's confessions were contradictory and all over the place for the first 60 sessions. Suddenly, in the last 2 sessions, they magically started to make some sort of coherent sense. Hamada Sumio, a professor emeritus at Nara Women's University and critic of Japan's use of confessions, said the following: Hirasawa turned to confess to the crime after denying his involvement, but the confession statements show he knew nothing about the crucial points: how he obtained the poison, how the victims died, and how he used the money. He did not have to conceal them once he admitted to the murder. He even told investigators that he found it difficult to make what he was saying consistent. It indicates Hirasawa struggled to draw the plot of the crime on the assumption that he himself was the culprit. Hirasawa was a painter. He would have no knowledge about the correct ways to administer cyanides, let alone about precipitate. In his confession, the information he gave was incorrect. He said that he used 15.9 grams of potassium cyanide mixed into 80 cc's of water as the poison. But this amount of cyanide would have been instantly lethal to the victims, not the slow poisoning of the Teikoku Incident. Leaving the actual confession aside, the circumstances in which it happened are as strange as the rest of the case. Reporter and big fan of the Metropolitan Police, Takada Shuji, swore he was there when the confession occurred. But not only did Procurator Takagi deny that any reporter was there, he denied even knowing who the man was. On the other hand, Takagi says that Hirasawa made his confession to Takagi's then superior, a man named Ide. But the Society to Save Hirasawa checked the prison logbooks, and Ide was nowhere on them for the day in question. Takagi says someone must have forgotten to write Ide's name down. And just in case you think that's all, Hirasawa was made to repeat his confession in front of a judge named Ishizaki Shiro. Justice Ishizaki was the same judge who would later preside over Hirasawa's murder trial. I'm not sure whether the trial was a jury trial or a bench trial, meaning the judge decides the verdict, but either way, that seems shady. I know we've covered a lot of evidence in this episode, but remember that 190,000 yen that Hirasawa had in his possession? The generally held belief is that he had been commissioned to paint pornographic artwork. He would never have admitted to it if it was the case. It would have been extremely damaging to his reputation, perhaps even as damaging as an accusation of murder. In 1964, a man actually came forward saying he had given Hirasawa Sadamichi that money. This man's name was Nomura Haumichi, and he said he had never come forward before because Hirasawa had been having an affair with his daughter. However, when asked about this at trial, Nomura said he lied. The Society to Save Hirasawa believes he was threatened to change his story, but authorities believe Nomura and Morikawa Tetsuro conspired. Both were charged with perjury. Something that I've not seen people go into is that stolen check from Goto Toyoharu. It was stolen with the money, so we know it was evidence, and it turned up at another bank. I think someone came in to case the banks pretending to be this Goto, but it probably wasn't the poisoner because no one remembers him coming into the bank before. That implies that at least 2 men were involved in this crime. Many people believe that Hirasawa Sadamichi was an innocent man. Back in 2006, 100-year-old psychiatrist Akimoto Haruo was fighting for Hirasawa because he believed he was one of many who have had their human rights violated by the Japanese judicial system. Akimoto had seen other abuses. He had been one of 6 doctors who had examined Aum Shinrikyo founder Asahara Shoko and found him mentally incompetent, but the courts listened to a court-appointed psychiatrist that told them what they wanted to hear and ignored Akimoto and the others. Akimoto Haruo said, "A court cannot fulfill its duty, protection of human rights, if it ignores the truth." The former head of Teikyo University's pharmaceutical department, Indo Hiroyoshi, even doubts that the poison used was potassium cyanide at all, because of the time it took for the victims to die. There are many other experts and amateurs who believe in Hirasawa Sadamichi's innocence. Many more than I can name, given the language barrier between myself and my sources. Many people have lived and died with the quest of clearing this man's name, and it's both inspiring and sad. It should be obvious that at this point, that I don't believe in Hirasawa's guilt. There's a deeper injustice here than just having an innocent man die in prison. 14 people are dead, and we'll probably never see real justice for them. I think this case really highlights how powerless we can be when governments just decide to ignore our rights. There's a particular callousness that seeps from this case from all official corners. From the Imperial Japanese Army's disregard for human life, to the US decision that those human lives were an acceptable loss in their quest for research results. I'm at a loss for how I should feel about this one. Actually, I have too many feelings. I'm ashamed that my government seems to make a habit of morally bankrupt decisions in the name of Homeland Security. I'm angry that a man was convicted on so little evidence. I'm disgusted by Imperial Japan's bioweapon research. And I'm just sad that so many people died for so little. Because whether you believe that the Teikoku victims were the victims of a bank robbery, a terrorist attack, or a bioweapons test, it wasn't worth the loss of 14 innocent lives. That's the end of the story I have for you today. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, follow, you know the drill. I'm researching and writing the episode on Unit 731, and that will be a Patreon exclusive episode for the $3 tier. It'll go up as soon as I'm done with it, not on a scheduled day. So if you subscribe, you'll have access to that episode, any future exclusive episodes I make. You'll have your name on this special screen at the end of YouTube episodes, access to an exclusive Discord, future episode polls, and more. As always, stay safe and stay hydrated.